in an accessible format. A recent graduate of philosophy and theology from St. John's College at Oxford University, Alex is an international public speaker and debater, and he is joining us virtually today. Please welcome Alex O'Connor.
Thank you, everybody. Hoping you can all hear me. I'm not sure. The software we're using means that I can only see myself right now. I'm trusting that I'm coming through okay, but I've got no indication of knowing that that's the case. So either we're about to spend 20 minutes or so talking about what I think humanism can do to move towards a more ethical future, or I'm about to talk to myself about the same subject for 20 minutes. Neither can be a full waste of time, so hopefully you're with me, and I'll begin talking about what it is that I want to bring to your attention. I was contacted by your society and was glad to speak to it on this topic of the future of humanism, but I was told in the original email that some of the members were particularly interested in hearing about my views on non-human animal ethical issues. This may seem a little strange to be talking about other animals in the context of humanism. After all, humanism seems to be something about human beings rather, or as distinct from other animals. But I want to talk about why, if we want to be consistent to the principles that underlie humanism, it must be something that expands to at least a consideration of non-humans. And so whether that be an expansion of or a adaptation of, let's say, humanism, it's something worth attaining. I'm often skeptical of using the term humanism precisely because I don't want to give an indication that I think that ethics is grounded solely in the human person. But this is something that humanism does well. There are two senses in which I think humanism tries to ground ethics in the human being. The first is to make the human being special as opposed to being or to having its moral value derived from the authority of anything supernatural. This is one of the tenets of humanism, which is not always thought to be completely necessary to being a humanist. It seems not to be a strict inconsistency to be a religious believer who's also a humanist, but depending on which human definition of humanism you're using, it may be that there's at least an assumption that ethics doesn't need to be grounded in anything supernatural. So one sense in which humanism is about humans is in this sense. It's about humans and nothing more. So this is an attempt to prevent the focal point of ethics being moved from the human above the human to somewhere else. There's another sense in which humanism is human, and that's in its unifying quality of bringing human beings together. The idea is that ethics is based on something like rationality, and it's based on something like human reason. And this is something that's shared across all members of Homo sapiens as a species. And so there's a unifying quality. So the other radical move that humanism makes, separate from eliminating the supernatural element of ethics, is that it claims a radical equality between human beings in terms of their moral worth. I say that this is radical despite the fact that in modern society it's a fairly common claim that human beings are equal. Historically speaking, this has not been the case. It's a relatively new experiment to treat all human beings as if they have essentially the same inherent moral worth, and there may be different contexts in which we care about them differently. We might care about friends or family more than a stranger, but in terms of the inherent moral worth that they have as derived from our ethical principles, which humanism will derive from human reason itself, all human beings are equal here. Now, the question that I think an animal ethicist or someone with an interest in animal ethics like myself will want to ask is why we should stop there. What is it? What is the radical step that humanism made? Well, it said that we live in a world where a lot of people think that there are relevant distinctions between human beings on essentially morally arbitrary premises, things like race or gender, sexuality, and that though once these were considered to be morally relevant in determining how much a person is worth or what kind of moral respect we should afford to them, this is something that humanism seeks to fight against. And The animal ethicist simply says that a continuation of this logic leads us to a moral consideration of animals. I want to clear up a misconception. A lot of people think of those who care about animal ethics, and particularly of vegans and people like them, that we're asking for something even, well, considerably more radical, let's say, than the humanist project so far. And that is to consider non-human animals as having the same inherent moral worth as human beings. That's not what we're asking. All we're asking is that animals are afforded the kind of ethical consideration that we think that they deserve. That doesn't mean that they're afforded the same amount as human beings, but it means that they're afforded far more than they are now, particularly when you consider how regularly and how torturously and barbarically we use them to produce our food and clothing and cosmetics, among other things. So it's up to you to decide whether you think that this should be considered as an expansion of the humanist project. Some people see it as a negation of the humanist project, undermining the idea that ethics is about human beings and instead being about something like sentience. But whichever way you see it, the principle that underlies humanism certainly seems to commit us to a view that if something can feel, if something has sentience, if something has an experience of pain, that is, experiences of the world that it would rather not experience, then those experiences should count for something. After all, this is what human ethics is often grounded in once we remove the supernatural element. We must ask the question, although we want to be able to say that we can be ethical people without the supervision of a God, the question remains, what is ethics? What does ethics become when you remove the supernatural authority from the ethics? Well, it has to be something like an attention to the suffering of human beings, the balance of suffering and pleasure, the respect of human beings as individuals. It has to be something about dignity. It has to be something, it could potentially be something about rights that are thought to be possessed by human beings as a simple product of their birth. And the question that we'll want to ask is, does this apply to animals too? Now, on the point of suffering, this seems trivially obvious. Some people throughout the history of philosophy have tried to deny the proposition that non-human animals can feel pain. This is a very unpopular approach, and although it is strictly impossible to prove that non-humans feel pain, given that this is an experienced phenomenon by definition, and so something we'll never have epistemic access to, I have as much evidence that a pig or a cow feels pain as I do that a human being does. I want to offer something for your consideration. If somebody ever tries to talk to you about animal ethics and says, well, look, I think that a cow feels less pain than a human does, or feels pain in a minimized sense, or maybe doesn't feel pain at all. I have no way to disprove this, but it is mere conjecture. There's no proof of this claim. It's just something that could be the case. The way that I combat this line of thought is to offer what seems to me an equally plausible conjecture in the opposite direction. Animals are considerably more sensory-driven creatures than we are. That is, they rely more on their crude sensory experience of the world. And I think the reason for this is because human beings and their capacity for rationality are a product of evolution. Evolution, of course, selects for survivability. It models biological organisms in such a way as makes them best able to survive. So if we ask why a rational capacity, which is what humanists like to ground ethics in, evolved in human beings, well, the way to answer that question is to say that it must serve our survival. Okay, so maybe the reason why we have a rational capacity is so that when we experience pain or when something threatens our survival, we're able to abstract this threat and avoid it in the future without having to continually be burned by the stove. We just know through our reasoning faculty that, well, if we touch the stove, it's going to burn our hands, so we don't do it anymore. And so that's why the faculty evolves. It helps us to survive and avoid pain in these situations. Non-human animals don't have this capacity. And so they must rely more strongly on their pain receptors and their crude sensory experience of the world. Nobody denies that a dog can experience smell much more acutely and intensely than any human being is capable of imagining. And why is this the case? Well, a dog relies so much more strongly on its sense of smell to navigate the world than a human being does. That's why we accept that they experience smell in this much heightened sense than we do. Similarly, the eyesight of a hawk, for example, is considered to be far more acute and intense than any human being could possibly imagine. We could never know what it's like to visualize the world in the way that they do, and that's because they rely more strongly on their eyesight than we do to help them to survive. So on this point about animal suffering, if we accept that these animals are more sensory-driven creatures and that in other contexts they actually experience certain sensory data far more intensely and acutely than we do, then why would this not be the same of pain? In other words, it may be that pain is experienced by a dog or a hawk, or indeed a pig or a cow or a chicken, as more intense and acute than we're capable of imagining, because these animals are relying on their crude sensory experience of the world, because they don't have the rational capacity to abstract the source of that suffering and no longer require the constant threat of real pain to prevent them from doing dangerous things. I hope this makes sense, because what I'm trying to get across to you is that animal suffering may be an incredibly important issue. I think it is an incredibly important issue anyway, but it may be even more important than we think it is, because these animals may even, their physical pain may be experienced as even worse. And so if the humanist wants to ground moral worth in something like the respect for the mental states of human beings, and that's got something to do with the fact that human beings are creatures who can suffer and who have experiences that they want and that they don't want, the same thing should be at least true of non-human animals, and perhaps even more true. So I think that the future of humanism, which is the topic that I was sort of asked to roughly be speaking about, must involve an expansion of this principle. Again, if we consider the history of the humanist ethic, we begin by asking people, and I mean the unifying quality of the humanist ethic that says that all human beings are worthy of moral dignity and respect. We look at the history of moral thought on this and how it evolves, and it essentially consists in pointing out to people who think that certain Homo sapiens are not really human, or they are humans, but their suffering counts for less, or it doesn't really matter as much, that they're essentially committing an inconsistency. Of course, one of the fundamental building blocks of rationality is consistency. Without consistency, you can't have rationality. And so we must make sure that we're consistent in our views with towards human beings as we are with animals. Now, the way that this can often cash out is by, if we retrace the history of ethics, if we look at the great strides against racism and sexism and look at how they were done, you'd ask somebody, why is it that you're a racist? What is it that you think is different about another person on account of their skin color or ethnic origin that you think makes them worth morally less? Now, crucially, the history of anti-racism has not been primarily based on an attempt to make all human beings literally equal, that is, the same. Of course, people are not the same. People have different height averages, they have different skin colors, they have different cultural heritage, they have different, all kinds of physical and cultural features. But the point of being an anti-racist is not to deny these differences, but rather to say that these differences are not morally relevant. It's just part of the variance of our species. But in terms of our judgment of the moral worth of such a being, it doesn't make a difference. So now when we consider a non-human animal, we can say that, yeah, of course, they're very different to us in a great many important ways. They have different numbers of legs, they have different kinds of skin, they have fur or scales, perhaps. But these are not the morally relevant characteristics which justify our ethical concern. If they were, then suppose we said that we found something that was true of an animal that's not true of a human being, and that's why we treat them differently. There's a popular argument called the name the trait argument, which says that, can we actually identify what this is? If we say that a pig shouldn't be considered as part of our ethical community because we're humanists, we're about human beings and we care about humans in particular, and we're not going to encompass seriously the prospect of pig suffering, say, okay, well, how like a pig and in what ways would a human being have to be in order for you to justify treating that human being like the pig? Because suppose I took a human being and I gave him 4 legs. Can I now treat him how we currently treat pigs, which includes forcing them into cages and a whole number of other things that I don't want to go into because they're quite disgusting, but eventually ending in their lives being ended in the gas chamber of carbon dioxide, as about 86% of slaughtered pigs are in my country, at least. where regulations are even tighter than in the United States. Okay, so if I give that human being 4 legs, can I treat that human being in such a way? Well, no, because having 4 legs is not a morally relevant characteristic. Okay, let's say I change the human being's skin color. They've now got pink skin. Can I force that human being into that gas chamber? Definitely not. That's not morally relevant. But even the points that are sometimes brought up, such as the fact that pigs are far less intelligent than we are, I don't doubt it. But if I took a human being and lowered their intelligence, say to the level of a pig's, would I be able to force that human being into that gas chamber? Still no. Because even if intelligence is somehow morally relevant to a person's sense of self or dignity or something like this, maybe, there's no way in which it's so morally relevant that that difference in intelligence can justify a radical difference in treatment. And yet, what we essentially do here is we take this human being and we transform them into a pig. Because now we have a human being who's got 4 legs and pink skin and a curly tail and has the intelligence level of a pig and experiences the world like a pig. But we haven't found a point at which we say, okay, now it's okay to treat this human being how we treat other pigs. But this creature that we have is identical to a pig now. And so our only option is to say that the way we're treating all of these other pigs is wrong. And what that requires is an expansion of our sense of inherent worth and moral respect beyond just the human to encompass non-human animals too. There's a good quote actually by one of your founders, Thomas Jefferson, which I believe I have here somewhere at least, which is quoted by Peter Singer in Animal Liberation, which I think is quite instructive on this point about the history of ethical thought and the arbitrariness of moral characteristics. Jefferson, in a different context, was writing to a friend, an author of a book. Somebody had written a book about the intellectual achievements of people of color and their artistic achievements too. And of course, the implicit reason for doing this at the time of the founding of the United States was to advocate for the moral consideration or equal moral consideration of people of different skin colors. So the book was written as a survey of the intellectual and artistic achievements of Black people. Now, Thomas Jefferson wrote to this author and said the following: "Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I myself have entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature, and to find that they are on a par with ourselves. But whatever be the degree of talent, it is no measure of their rights. Because Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not therefore lord of the property or persons of others." So in other words, what Jefferson is saying here is that it's wonderful that you're highlighting that people of different skin colors can be just as smart and artistically creative as we can, but that's actually not morally relevant, because even if they couldn't be, we wouldn't consider this a rationale for treating them morally differently. And in the context of the animal discussion, this is where this line of thought becomes particularly relevant, because we have a situation in which actually there are differences here. Unlike racism, which is often grounded on a fraudulent sense of difference in intellect or intelligence or ability, the distinction between humans and other animals is grounded on a real distinction. That is, these non-human animals are really different from human beings. They actually are less intelligent. They actually are less self-aware. They have less forms of suffering and pleasures available to them. They can't worry about their taxes, for example. There are all kinds of things that are inaccessible to them. But the question is, which of these differences are actually relevant to considering what their moral worth is? Now, I think that there are some. I think that there are morally relevant characteristics that should come into play here and would allow us to favor the life of a human being over another kind of animal. I'm not saying that faced with the choice between saving a dog or a pig from drowning and a human being, that you should be indifferent. I certainly would save the human being. Not asking you to see these animals as worth the same as humans, but just to expand this principle that if it can feel, it deserves our moral consideration, and just to give it the moral consideration it deserves. So I say that wouldn't be the same as human beings, but it would be more than what we're giving them at the moment. So this would be, if not an expansion of humanism, an expansion of the humanist principle of grounding ethics in rationality and a sense of ability to feel and suffering. That more or less is the connection, I think, let's say, between the humanist project and something like the vegan project or the animal ethic project. But of course, this has been vaguely grounded in notions of suffering, and I recognize that people will have different meta-ethical theories. Some people, I think it's most common in secular circumstances to find that people ground ethics in something like suffering, pleasure, and pain. But some people also believe in rights that human beings have, and it's not just a utilitarian calculus, but there are such things as rights. This is obviously easily applicable to animals as well. There are lots of other approaches. I like the Rawlsian approach, for example. John Rawls, a famous political philosopher of the 20th century, whose most famous thought experiment was that of the veil of ignorance, which you may be familiar with. When trying to figure out how we should design political society, John Rawls suggested that we imagined ourselves behind a veil of ignorance. We didn't know what we were going to be. We're just about to enter the world, and we don't know who we're going to be. We could be rich, we could be poor, we could be black or white, we could be old or young. We don't know anything. We should design society as a rational person would do, as a self-interested person would do, from behind that veil. And what would you do? Well, maybe you'd have a capitalist society, so that when you have a bit of money, you can, put it to good use. But you wouldn't maybe want a totally libertarian society, because if you're born poor with absolutely no money, you'd want some kind of social safety net or something like this. And so Rawls is suggesting something a bit like that. He says that this is just what the rational person would do from behind that veil of ignorance. And the reason that this thought experiment is so powerful is because it makes a lot of intuitive sense. Ethics, if it's going to really be ethics, has to be just, and justice has to be blind. So the best way to fairly design society is to do so from a position where you don't know who you're going to be. But of course, we can take this Rawlsian principle and expand it to include all kinds of things, including, of course, non-human animals. But we could say, look, let's say you're behind this Rawlsian veil of ignorance, and you don't know what you're going to be. You don't know if you're going to be poor. You don't know if you're going to be rich. You don't know if you're going to be white or black. You don't know anything about yourself, but you also don't know if you're going to be human. You could be a pig. You could be a cow. We could even say you could be a tree, or you could be a brick, or you could be a table. You could be any number of these things. Now design society. Now, would you want a society in which trees are sometimes being cut down? Well, you could be a tree, but if you were a tree, you're not going to notice. You're not going to be alive and sentient, so you wouldn't care. So from behind this veil of ignorance, you'd say, yeah, sure, we'll allow people to cut down trees. Would you have society? Would you have agriculture? Would you have architecture? Well, probably yes, because I'm pretty sure these things would benefit me if I were a human. And they wouldn't be particularly harmful if I wasn't. Now ask yourself if you'd live in a world where there was factory farming, where there was a system of exploitation and use of animals by one particular animal, that is the human species, for mostly trivial reasons of taste, pleasure, sometimes for the sake of nutrition, even though alternatives are usually available. Would you allow this to obtain? Even if you're just being self-interested, even just purely rationally for yourself, you'd say, well, no, of course I wouldn't. I mean, sure, I could be a human being when I enter the world, and then I'd get to benefit from factory farming, but is that benefit that I would receive worth the pain that I might potentially go through if I end up being born a pig or a chicken? Chickens outnumber us 3-1 at any given moment, so you've got a far greater chance of being a chicken. So any rationally self-interested person from behind that veil of ignorance would design a society in which we have a much stricter moral consideration of non-human animals. And that's just what a person behind the veil of ignorance would do if they were acting in their own self-interest, let alone if they were acting in such a way that they thought would be morally preferable, that they thought would be the morally best outcome, not just best for themselves individually. So there are lots of different ways of looking at this, but I think that the takeaway is if we're going to be rational about this, and we're going to be consistent about this, then essentially any moral principle that can underlie humanism can also be expanded to at least include consideration of non-human animals, and that this should become one of the focal projects, I think, of humanism more broadly. And whether that be that humanism is affiliated with animal ethics, or whether it begins to encompass it such that animal ethics becomes a point of humanism itself, I don't particularly mind, but for me, the future of humanism must involve some kind of development of this attention to non-humans too. Um, but look, because I can't see you and I can't hear you, I don't actually know how long I'm supposed to be going on for. I have a feeling that I've been talking for around about 20 minutes now, and I hear that we have an opportunity for some Q&A. And even if I'm a little bit early, I think it'd be wonderful to move on to that as quickly as possible. So thank you all for listening, and hopefully we can open the floor and I can take any questions that anybody might have.